The morning sun broke cold and pale over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grassland. The wind carried the scent of distant rain and something else, blood. Crag stood at the edge of the outcropping, his massive frame silhouetted against the awakening sky. His heavy brow ridge caught the first light, and his thick shoulders rose and fell with each breath, steam curling from his nostrils in the freezing air. Behind him, the rest of the hunter-gatherer band stirred in the shallow cave system that had sheltered them through the night. The opening faced south, away from the worst winds, and the ledge outside provided a vantage point over the valley below. Smoke still rose from the central fire pit, where Nira had kept the flames alive through the darkness, as she did every night, her small frame hunched close to the embers, feeding them carefully with dried moss and brittle wood. Crag turned his head, the thick muscles of his neck bunching as he surveyed the band. There were 32 members in total, hunters, gatherers, young ones, and the old firekeeper, who had taught Nira her craft before his hands became too stiff to work. The hierarchy was clear and unchanging. Crag was the alpha male, the strongest hunter, the one who led the dangerous pursuits and made decisions when predators threatened or when the band needed to move to new hunting grounds. Below him in status were the other males, Torak, broad-shouldered and scarred across his left arm from a wolf encounter 2 winters past, Dren, younger but quick with a spear, and Grok, who was past his prime, but still useful in driving game toward the waiting hunters. Then came the females, and here the hierarchy grew more complex, more vicious in its own way. At the top stood Vara, tall for a female with powerful arms and legs thick with muscle. She had killed a lynx with her bare hands once, strangling it when it had attacked her while she gathered roots near a stream. The pelt still hung across her shoulders, a constant reminder of her strength. Her face was broad, her jaw heavy and pronounced, her eyes dark and calculating. She watched Crag constantly, positioning herself near him during meals, offering him the choicest portions of meat, displaying her strength whenever possible. Beside Vara, always close, was Shala, equally powerful, though shorter and thicker through the torso. Her breasts were heavy, her hips wide, and she had borne 3 children, all of whom had survived past their second winter, a remarkable feat. She moved with the confidence of a proven mother, and she too sought Crag's attention, touching his arm when she passed, laughing loudly at his grunts and gestures, making sure he saw her carrying heavy loads with ease. Then there was Mira, Lena, Kessa, Drella, and dozens of others, each with her own strengths, each competing in subtle and not-so-subtle ways for position, for resources, for the attention of the strongest male. Some were skilled at finding hidden tubers and roots. Others could track wounded animals for hours. A few were fierce protectors of the young ones, quick to drive off scavengers or smaller predators. And then, almost invisible in this hierarchy, was Nira. She sat now beside the fire pit, her thin arms wrapped around her drawn-up knees, her body so small and fragile that she seemed more child than adult female, though she had seen at least 18 winters. Her face was narrow, her eyes large and always darting, watching for danger or disapproval. Her hair hung in dark, tangled strands around her hollow cheeks. Her arms were like sticks, her legs barely strong enough to carry her own weight, let alone contribute to the heavy work of the band. But Nira had one skill, one purpose that kept her alive. She could keep fire. It was not a skill that impressed the others. Fire was simply there, a constant presence, and as long as it burned, no one thought much about it or about the small, silent female who made sure it never died. But if the flames ever went out, the band would face a crisis, cold nights that killed the young and old, no way to cook meat or drive away the large predators that prowled the darkness, no smoke to cure hides, or harden spear points. Nira understood this even if no one else seemed to, so she stayed by the fire, feeding it, protecting it, and trying to remain unnoticed. Crag grunted, a low sound that brought the other hunters to attention. He gestured toward the valley, where a herd of horses grazed in the distance, their dark shapes moving slowly across the pale grass. It was a large herd, perhaps 40 animals, and among them were young ones, easier to separate and bring down. Torak moved beside Crag, his spear already in hand, his eyes narrowing as he studied the terrain. He pointed toward a gully that ran along the eastern edge of the valley, a natural funnel. If they could drive the herd in that direction, they could trap several animals against the steep walls. Crag nodded once, a gesture of agreement and command. He turned and barked a sharp sound, and immediately the other males gathered, Dren, Grok, and 2 younger hunters, barely old enough to join the pursuit. The females who were strong enough to help also prepared themselves: Vara, Shala, and Mira, along with 3 others. Their role would be to create noise and movement, to drive the herd toward the trap while the males positioned themselves for the kill. Nira watched from beside the fire as the hunting party prepared to descend into the valley. Vara glanced back at her, and for just a moment their eyes met. Vara's expression was one of pure contempt, a look that said clearer than any words, "You are useless. You contribute nothing." Nira lowered her gaze immediately, her thin fingers tightening around a piece of charred wood. She had learned long ago not to hold eye contact with Vara, or any of the stronger females. It only invited aggression, and she could not defend herself. The hunting party moved out, their footsteps crunching across the frost-hardened ground as they descended the slope. Nira could hear Vara's voice, loud and commanding, organizing the females who would drive the herd. She could hear Shala's laughter, deep and confident, and she could see Crag's massive form leading the males toward the gully, his spear balanced perfectly in his thick hand, his movements smooth despite his size. The rest of the band remained behind, mostly the young ones, a few old members too weak to hunt, and Nira. She turned her attention back to the fire, carefully adding small sticks to keep the flames steady. The old firekeeper, Orin, sat nearby, his milky eyes staring at nothing, his gnarled hands resting in his lap. He had taught Nira everything about fire, how to read the smoke, how to know when it needed air or fuel, how to bank it at night so it would survive until morning. "They do not see," Orin rasped, his voice like dried leaves scraping stone. Nira glanced at him, unsure if he was speaking to her or simply muttering to himself as he often did. "They see strength," Orin continued, his head tilting slightly toward the valley where the hunters had disappeared. "They see who can kill, who can carry, who can fight, but they do not see what keeps them alive when the sun goes down." Nira said nothing. She had heard Orin speak this way before, but his words changed nothing. The band valued what they could see and touch: meat, strength, children. Fire was just there, like air, like water, necessary but unremarkable. A sharp cry echoed up from the valley, followed by the thundering sound of hooves. The hunt had begun. Nira stood, moving to the edge of the outcropping to watch. She could see the herd scattering, panicked, and the dark figures of the hunters moving with purpose, driving several horses toward the gully. Vara's voice rose above the chaos, directing the other females with sharp barks and gestures. Then Nira saw Crag. He had positioned himself at the narrow end of the gully, his spear raised, his body coiled like a spring. 2 young horses, separated from the main herd, thundered toward him, their eyes wide with terror. Crag waited utterly still and then struck. His spear drove deep into the first horse's chest, and the animal crashed to the ground, legs thrashing. The second horse tried to veer away, but Torak was there, his own spear finding its mark. The valley filled with the sounds of dying animals, the shouts of triumph from the hunters, and the heavy breathing of exhausted humans. It should have been a perfect hunt. But then, Nira saw something that made her breath catch. A massive bull horse, far larger than the others, had broken through the line of females. It was charging directly at Crag, who was still crouched beside his first kill, working to free his spear from the animal's ribs. He looked up too late. The bull horse slammed into him with the force of a landslide. Crag's body lifted off the ground and flew backward, crashing against the rocky wall of the gully. The sound of impact echoed across the valley, a terrible wet crack that made Nira's stomach turn. Vara screamed, a sound of pure fury and fear. She and the other hunters rushed toward the fallen alpha male, but the bull horse was already gone, disappearing with the rest of the fleeing herd. Nira stood frozen on the outcropping, her hands clutching at her thin chest. She could see them gathering around Crag's body, could see Torak kneeling beside him, could see Vara pushing others aside to get closer. Then, impossibly, Crag moved. He rolled onto his side, gasping, his face twisted in agony. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and blood streamed from a gash along his ribs. But he was alive. The hunters began the slow process of carrying him back to the cave, supporting his massive weight between them. Vara walked beside him, her hand on his good shoulder, her face fierce with possession and concern. Shala was on his other side, helping to bear his weight, her expression equally intense. As they climbed the slope back toward the cave, Nira retreated to the fire, making room for what she knew would come next: the chaos of treating injuries, the competition among the females to care for the fallen alpha male, the jockeying for position that always happened when weakness showed in a leader. They carried Crag into the cave and laid him near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, but not so close as to overheat. He was breathing hard, his face pale beneath the dirt and blood. His left arm was definitely broken, bent wrong between elbow and shoulder, and the gash along his ribs revealed white bone beneath torn flesh. Immediately, the strongest females surrounded him. Vara knelt at his head, her hands touching his face, speaking to him in low, urgent sounds. Shala examined his injuries, her thick fingers surprisingly gentle as she probed his ribs. Nira brought water in a birch-bark container, offering it to his lips. Kessa and Drella hovered nearby, ready to assist, their eyes fixed on the wounded alpha male with a mixture of concern and calculation. In the background, pushed to the edges, were the lesser females, those without the strength or status to demand proximity to Crag. They watched with hungry eyes, knowing that if Crag survived, whichever female cared for him most effectively would rise in status. If he died, the hierarchy would shatter and reform around whoever Torak or another male claimed as the new alpha. Nira sat beside her fire, as far from the commotion as possible while still remaining in the cave. She fed sticks into the flames, keeping them steady, watching the drama unfold with wide, frightened eyes. Crag's eyes opened, clouded with pain. He looked at the faces surrounding him. Vara, Shala, Nira, all the strong females vying for his attention. Each one touched him, offered him something, displayed their worthiness to be chosen as his primary mate, his protector, his companion. But Crag's gaze drifted past them all. His eyes moved slowly across the cave, searching, until they found the small, thin figure sitting beside the fire. He looked at Nira. For a long moment, neither moved. Nira felt her heart hammering in her chest, certain she had done something wrong, that somehow she had drawn his attention and would now be punished for it. But Crag did not look angry. He looked focused, deliberate. Then, to everyone's shock, Crag moved. He pushed Vara's hands away from his face, ignoring her protests. He rolled onto his good side, his broken arm dragging uselessly, his face contorting with agony, and he began to crawl. Inch by inch, dragging his massive, broken body across the cave floor, Crag crawled toward the fire, toward Nira. Vara's face transformed from concern to confusion to outrage. "Crag!" she barked, her voice sharp with command and disbelief. She reached for him, trying to pull him back, but he shrugged her off with surprising force despite his injuries. Shala stood, her face darkening. "What are you doing?" she demanded, though she knew he could not answer with words. The question was rhetorical, an expression of her shock and growing anger. The other females stirred, murmuring among themselves, their eyes wide with disbelief. The males, too, watched with confusion. Why would the alpha male reject the care of the strongest females? Why would he drag himself across the cave floor in such obvious pain? And why was he crawling toward the firekeeper, the smallest, weakest, most insignificant female in the entire band? Crag's breathing was labored now, each movement costing him dearly, but he did not stop. He pulled himself forward with his good arm, his legs pushing weakly, his broken arm trailing behind, leaving a smear of blood across the stone floor. Nira pressed herself back against the cave wall, her eyes enormous with terror. She had no idea what to do, no idea what Crag wanted, no idea why he was coming toward her. She looked desperately toward Vara, toward Shala, as if seeking permission or explanation, but their faces showed only fury and bewilderment. Finally, Crag reached the fire. He collapsed beside it, his chest heaving, his face beaded with sweat despite the cold. He lay there for a moment, gathering what strength remained, and then he lifted his head. He looked directly at Nira, and then he looked at the fire. Then, back at Nira. The message was unmistakable, even without words. You, fire. Protect. Nira's hands trembled as she understood, or thought she understood. He was not seeking her care. He was not choosing her above the others. He was positioning himself near the one thing that mattered most for survival, the flames that would keep him warm, that would hold back infection, that would keep him alive through the coming night. He was choosing the fire, and she was simply the keeper of it. But to the rest of the band, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like the alpha male, wounded and vulnerable, had rejected the 100 displays of strength and beauty and capability from the powerful females who surrounded him. It looked like he had chosen, instead, to place himself under the protection of the smallest, weakest, most pathetic female among them. Vara's face twisted with something dark and dangerous. her hands clenched into fists, her powerful shoulders hunching forward. Beside her, Sharla's expression was equally furious, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Nira with undisguised hatred. Around them, the other females began to whisper, their voices rising like the hiss of disturbed serpents. Jealousy, confusion, and rage rippled through the group, transforming the atmosphere of the cave from one of concern for their leader to something far more volatile. Nira wanted to disappear. She wanted to explain that she had done nothing, that she had not asked for this, that she wanted no part of whatever was happening, but she could not speak. She could only sit there, frozen, as Crag's massive, broken body settled beside the fire, his eyes closing in exhaustion or pain. The flames crackled and danced, casting shifting shadows across the cave walls. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the successful hunt should have been a cause for celebration. But inside the cave, a different kind of danger was taking shape, one born not from predators or starvation, but from the far more complicated and vicious dynamics of hierarchy, jealousy, and wounded pride. Nira fed another stick into the fire, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, hostile, envious, calculating eyes that promised consequences she could not yet imagine. The alpha male had crawled to her fire, and nothing would ever be the same. The sun reached its highest point and began its slow descent toward the western hills, casting the cave entrance in amber light. The hunting party had brought back enough meat to feed the band for several days, 2 young horses and part of a third that Torak had managed to wound before it escaped. Under normal circumstances, this would be a time of celebration, of full bellies and satisfied grunts, of stories told through gestures and sounds around the fire. But nothing about this day was normal. Crag lay motionless beside the fire pit, his massive chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His broken arm had been pulled straight by Torak and Grok, the bone grinding audibly as they worked, causing Crag to release a roar of agony that echoed across the valley. They had bound the arm tightly with strips of hide and splintered it with straight branches, but everyone knew that such an injury might never heal properly. A hunter who could not use both arms was only half a hunter, and an alpha male who showed weakness invited challenge. The wound along his ribs was equally serious. Sharla had cleaned it with cold water from the stream, her thick fingers surprisingly deft as she picked out dirt and small stones. The gash was deep, exposing the white curve of his lowest rib, and it would need to stay clean to avoid the rot that killed so many who survived their initial injuries. She had packed it with moss, the kind Orin had taught the band would slow bleeding, and wrapped his torso with more hide strips. Through all of this, Crag had remained beside the fire, beside Nira. The fragile firekeeper had not moved from her position against the cave wall. She sat with her knees drawn up, her thin arms wrapped around them, trying to make herself as small as possible while the strongest females in the band worked around her, their movements sharp with barely contained fury. Every time one of them passed close to Nira, she flinched, expecting a blow or a shove, but they could not touch her. Not while Crag was there, not while his choice, irrational and incomprehensible as it was, had placed her under his implicit protection. Vara had tried 3 times to move Crag away from the fire, back to a sleeping area where he could rest more comfortably, where she and the other strong females could tend to him properly. Each time Crag had resisted, his good arm pushing her away, his eyes opening just enough to fix her with a look that allowed no argument. He would stay by the fire, and that meant he would stay near Nira. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the cave grew thicker than smoke. The other females began to gather in small groups, their voices low and sharp as they discussed what had happened. Nira could not hear their exact words, but she could read their body language clearly enough, the aggressive gestures toward her, the frustrated glances at Crag's prone form, the way they touched their own bodies, displaying their strength and health as if trying to understand why these obvious advantages had been overlooked. Mira was the first to approach the fire circle directly. She was younger than Vara or Sharla, but powerfully built through the shoulders, with strong hands that could snap thick branches for kindling. She carried a wooden bowl containing chunks of raw liver, the most prized part of the kill, usually reserved for the hunters who had made the kills. She knelt beside Crag, her posture submissive but deliberate, and held the bowl out to him. "Crag," she said, using the sound that served as his name. "Eat. Strong." Crag's eyes opened. He looked at the liver, then at Mira, then past her to where Vara and Sharla watched with predatory intensity. He understood the game being played. By accepting food from Nira, he would be showing favor, acknowledging her status, perhaps even indicating a preference that would elevate her position in the hierarchy. But Crag did not take the liver. Instead, his eyes moved to Nira. The small firekeeper went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Crag made a sound, low, commanding, and gestured with his good hand toward the bowl, then toward Nira. The meaning was unmistakable. Give it to her. Nira's face transformed. The submissive expression vanished, replaced by shock and then anger. Her grip on the bowl tightened until her knuckles went white. "No," she said, the word coming out harsh and flat. "Crag, no." Nira gestured dismissively toward Nira, a gesture that encompassed the firekeeper's entire inadequate existence. "She weak, she nothing." Crag's expression darkened. He repeated the gesture, more forcefully this time, and when Nira still hesitated, he tried to rise, his broken body tensing with the effort despite the obvious pain it caused him. Nira backed away quickly, frightened by the intensity of his reaction. She set the bowl down halfway between Crag and Nira, refusing to place it directly in the firekeeper's hands, and then retreated to where the other females waited. The bowl sat there, steam rising from the fresh liver, while Nira stared at it with wide, terrified eyes. She had never been offered liver before. She had never been offered any choice meat. Her portions were always the scraps, the bits others did not want, the bones with traces of marrow after everyone else had finished. To take the liver now would be to accept something she had no right to claim a status she did not possess. But Crag was watching her, waiting. With trembling hands, Nira reached out and pulled the bowl toward herself. The liver was still warm, and the smell made her mouth water despite her fear. She picked up a small piece, the smallest piece, and brought it to her lips. The taste exploded across her tongue, rich, iron-heavy, dense with the essence of strength. She had to force herself to chew slowly, to not devour it like a starving scavenger. Behind her, she heard Vara's voice rise in anger, words tumbling out in a cascade of fury directed at the other females. Nira did not need to hear the specific sounds to understand the message. This is wrong, this cannot stand. Something must be done. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, the band settled into their evening routines. But the familiar patterns felt wrong, distorted. Usually the strongest females positioned themselves closest to Crag during the night, benefiting from his body heat and his protection. But now, Crag lay beside the fire, and Nira sat against the wall just beyond him, and the space around them had become a kind of no-man's land that none of the other females dared to enter. Vara, Shala, and the others arranged themselves in a rough semicircle on the opposite side of the fire, their eyes never leaving Nira, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. The males, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its source, kept their distance, focusing on their own concerns, sharpening spear points, examining the day's wounds, chewing strips of horse meat. Old Orin shuffled over to sit near Nira, his milky eyes reflecting the firelight. He settled himself slowly, his joints creaking, and for a long time he simply sat in silence. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You must feed the fire all night," he said. "Do not let it die. Not tonight." Nira nodded, understanding the deeper meaning beneath his words. The fire was her only protection now, the only thing standing between her and the wrath of females who saw her as having stolen something that rightfully belonged to them. As long as the flames burned, as long as she proved her value, she might survive. "I will," she whispered back. "I will keep it alive." Orin's gnarled hand reached out and patted her thin knee, a gesture of solidarity from one marginal member of the band to another. Then he withdrew into himself, his head dropping to his chest as sleep claimed him. The night deepened. Stars emerged in the cloudless sky beyond the cave entrance, cold and distant. The temperature plummeted, and frost began to form on the rocks outside. Inside the cave, the fire became the center of existence, its warmth and light pushing back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Nira fed the flames carefully, methodically, just as Orin had taught her. She read the color of the smoke, the height of the flames, the way the wood collapsed into embers. She knew exactly when to add fuel, and when to let it burn down slightly to create a bed of coals that would hold heat through the coldest hours. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even though her heart hammered with anxiety, and her eyes darted constantly toward the watching females. Crag slept fitfully, his body fighting fever from his injuries. Sweat beaded on his heavy brow despite the cold, and occasionally he would mutter wordless sounds, or his muscles would twitch as if he were still fighting the bull horse that had crushed him. Each time he stirred, Nira froze, terrified that he would wake fully and realize his mistake, realize that he had crawled toward the wrong female, the worthless female, and would drive her away with violence. But he did not wake. He simply continued to sleep beside the fire, his broken body trusting in its warmth. Around midnight, when most of the band had fallen into deep sleep, Nira heard movement. Her head snapped up, her body tensing, and she saw 3 shapes rising from the far side of the fire, Vara, Shala, and Mira, moving together with clear purpose. They approached the fire circle slowly, their faces carved from shadows and flame. Vara led, her powerful body moving with predatory grace. When they reached the edge of the light, they stopped, forming a line that blocked Nira's view of the rest of the cave. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Vara leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. "You are nothing," she said, each word precise and cutting. "You have no strength. You cannot hunt. You cannot fight. You cannot bear strong children. You are stick body. You are weak bones. Why does Crag choose weak bones over strong?" Nira's mouth went dry. She wanted to explain that Crag had not chosen her, that he had chosen the fire, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, but the words would not come. She could only sit there, trembling, while the 3 most powerful females in the band stared down at her with undisguised hatred. Shala spoke next, her voice heavy with contempt. "I have 3 children, all strong, all live. My body makes life. What does your body make? Nothing. Only weak, only useless." Mira stepped closer, her face twisted with jealousy. "I bring food, I find roots, I carry heavy. What do? You sit, you watch fire. Baby can watch fire. You are less than baby." Vara raised her hand, and for a terrible moment, Nira thought she was going to strike. But instead, Vara pointed at the fire, her thick finger stabbing toward the flames. "Fire needs feeding," Vara said. "If fire dies, you die. We make sure. You understand?" The threat was clear. If Nira let the fire go out, even for a moment, even by accident, these females would kill her. It would be justified, even expected. The failure to maintain fire was a death sentence for the entire band, and punishment would be swift and brutal. Nira nodded frantically, her eyes wide with terror. "I understand," she whispered. "I keep fire. I keep it alive, always." Vara's eyes narrowed. She seemed disappointed that Nira had not challenged her, had not provided an excuse for violence. But she could not simply attack without cause, not with Crag lying right there, not without risking his anger when he woke. So instead, Vara leaned down until her face was very close to Nira's, close enough that the firekeeper could smell the horse meat on her breath, could see every detail of her broad, powerful features. "You are nothing," Vara repeated, making sure every word landed like a blow. "Crag is confused, hurt. When he heals, he will remember. He will see what you are. And then," she smiled, an expression without warmth or mercy, "then you will be back where you belong, in the shadows, forgotten." The 3 females withdrew, returning to their sleeping areas, but Nira knew they would be watching. Even in sleep, some part of them would remain alert, waiting for any mistake, any failure that would give them the excuse they needed. Nira's hands shook as she added more wood to the fire. She could not afford to sleep, could not risk even closing her eyes for too long. The fire had to stay alive. It was the only thing keeping her alive. Beside her, Crag's breathing remained steady, his massive chest rising and falling. In sleep, the lines of pain eased from his face, and Nira could see why the females competed so fiercely for his attention. He was magnificent, even broken, powerful in a way that went beyond mere physical strength. He was a leader, a protector, a force that held the band together through his presence alone. And somehow, impossibly, he had placed himself beside her fire. Nira did not understand it. She did not understand why he had dragged his broken body across the cave floor, why he had rejected the care of females who were so obviously superior to her in every way. But she understood one thing with absolute clarity. As long as Crag remained beside the fire, she had a chance to survive. And as long as she kept the flames burning, perhaps that chance would last until he healed enough to make his true choice clear. The night stretched on, cold and endless. Nira fed the fire stick by stick, watching the flames dance, listening to the sounds of the sleeping band around her. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, a lonely sound that echoed across the frozen valley. Another answered from a different direction, and then another, until a whole chorus of voices rose and fell beneath the stars. Nira added another piece of wood to the fire, and the flames leaped up, pushing back the darkness a little further. She would keep the fire alive. She would prove her worth even if it was only this one small thing. She would show them all that even the weakest member of the band could contribute something vital, something irreplaceable. Even if they never acknowledged it, even if they never saw her as anything more than the useless stick body who sat by the flames. As dawn approached, bringing the faintest grey light to the eastern sky, Nira remained awake, her eyes red and burning, her body aching with exhaustion. But the fire still burned, strong and steady, just as it had burned through every night since Orin had first taught her to tend it. Crag stirred beside her, his eyes opening slowly. He looked first at the fire, as if confirming that it still lived, and then his gaze moved to Nira. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not affection, not choosing, but a kind of acknowledgement. She had done what was needed. She had kept the flames alive. Crag's eyes closed again, and he drifted back into fevered sleep. But Nira felt something shift inside her chest, something small and fragile and unexpected. Hope. She fed another stick into the fire and watched it catch, watched the flames transform wood into warmth and light, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps she was not quite as invisible as she had always believed. 3 days passed, and Crag did not improve. The fever that had begun the night of his injury continued to burn through his body, causing him to sweat through the coldest hours and shiver when the sun was high. His broken arm swelled grotesquely, the flesh turning purple and black around the break, and the wound along his ribs showed signs of infection despite Sharla's careful cleaning. A foul smell began to emanate from the gash, the smell of flesh rotting while still alive. The band's concern deepened. Without Crag's leadership, decisions became more difficult. Torak tried to assume command of the hunters, but he lacked Crag's instinctive understanding of animal behavior and terrain. On the second day, he led a pursuit of a wounded deer that ended with the animal escaping into a ravine too dangerous to follow. On the third day, his attempt to drive a small herd of bison toward waiting hunters failed completely when the animals scattered in an unexpected direction, leaving the band with nothing to show for hours of effort. Meanwhile, the hierarchy among the females began to fracture. With Crag too ill to show preference or exert his authority, old tensions resurfaced and new alliances formed. Vara and Sharla, who had always competed fiercely for the alpha male's attention, now found themselves united in their fury at Nira. But other females saw opportunity in the chaos. Lena, who was skilled at finding hidden caches of nuts and roots, began to position herself more prominently, offering her finds directly to Torak in a clear bid to attach herself to the next potential. Alpha male. Kessa and Drella, both powerful in their own right, started to challenge Vara's orders, refusing to defer to her as they once had. Even Mira, usually content to follow Vara's lead, began to act more independently, as if testing whether the social order could be permanently disrupted. Through it all, Nira remained beside the fire, feeding it continuously, sleeping only in brief moments when exhaustion overwhelmed her. Her eyes had sunken deeper into her face, and her already thin body had grown gaunt from lack of proper food. She ate only what Crag did not finish, scraps of meat that had cooled, strips of dried hide that others discarded, a few withered berries that someone left near the fire pit. But she kept the flames alive. That was all that mattered. That was her purpose, her protection, her reason for existence. Crag's condition worsened on the fourth morning. He woke gasping, his eyes wild and unfocused, his good arm thrashing at invisible threats. The fever had taken hold of his mind, dragging him into a world of delusions and nightmares. He called out sounds that might have been names, made gestures as if throwing spears at enemies only he could see, and once he tried to rise, only to collapse back down with a cry of agony when his broken arm struck the ground. Sharla pushed her way to his side, her face creased with genuine worry. Whatever anger she felt toward Nira, her concern for Crag was real. She had mated with him twice during the previous warm season, and one of her children might be his. His death would diminish her status significantly, and more than that, she seemed to care for him in her own way. She examined his wounds carefully, peeling back the hide wrapping to reveal the festering gash along his ribs. The flesh around it had turned a sickly grey-green, and when she pressed gently near the wound, pus oozed out, thick and yellow. The smell made several nearby band members turn away in disgust. Rot, Shala said, her voice flat with grim certainty. Deep rot. He will die. The words fell into the cave like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the band. An alpha male's death created a dangerous vacuum, a period of instability, when the hierarchy had to reorganize itself, when challenges would be made and blood might be spilled. And if Crag died while positioned beside Nira, some of that blame would surely attach to the small firekeeper, regardless of logic or fairness. Vara rose to her feet, her powerful frame radiating fury. She pointed at Nira, her thick finger stabbing the air like a spear. She kills him, Vara declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the cave. Fire Girl does nothing, just sits, watches. Crag needs strong hands, strong medicine, but Fire Girl weak, useless. She lets him die. Nira shrank back against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She wanted to protest, to explain that she knew nothing of treating wounds, that she had no medicine to offer, that all she could do was tend the fire. But her voice would not come. It never came when she needed it most. Torak stepped forward, his scarred face thoughtful. He looked at Krag's fevered body, then at the fire, then at Nira. Unlike Vara, his expression held no particular hostility toward the small firekeeper. He was simply trying to solve a problem, to find a way to save the one who had led them for so many seasons. "Move him," Torak said, gesturing toward a darker section of the cave where several sleeping areas had been prepared. "Away from fire. Shala tend him there. Strong females make medicine." It was a reasonable suggestion, one that would restore the natural order. Crag surrounded by capable females who knew healing techniques, away from the confusing association with Nira. But when Torak and Grok bent to lift Crag's body, the wounded alpha male's eyes snapped open. Despite the fever, despite the delirium, Crag's will remained strong. He made a sound, sharp, commanding, and his good arm lashed out, striking Torak's hand away from him. Then he twisted his body toward the fire, toward Nira, pulling himself closer to the flames with his one functional arm. "No," Crag managed to rasp, the word barely recognizable but unmistakable in its meaning. "Fire. Stay." Torak stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He would not force an alpha male, even a dying one, to move against his will. That was not how the hierarchy worked. A leader's choice had to be respected, even when that choice made no sense. Vara's face transformed into something terrible, a mask of rage so pure and absolute that several of the younger children began to cry. She took 3 long strides toward Nira, her fists clenched, her body coiled for violence. "You!" she screamed, all pretense of control abandoned. "You do this, you make magic. You make Crag stupid, you put sickness in his head." Nira pressed herself as flat against the wall as possible, certain she was about to die. There was nowhere to run, no way to defend herself against Vara's strength. But then old Orin's voice cut through the chaos, surprisingly strong for one so frail. "No magic," Orin said, his milky eyes fixed on nothing but his words carrying weight nonetheless. "Crag knows. Fire keeps life. Cold kills. Rot fears heat. High stays near warmth. Smart. Not stupid." The logic was simple but undeniable. Every member of the band knew that infection worsened in cold, that wounds healed faster when kept warm, that heat drove away the evil spirits that fed on dying flesh. By staying near the fire, Crag was giving himself the best chance to survive. But Vara did not want logic. She wanted someone to blame, some way to make sense of the world being turned upside down. She stood there, breathing hard, her fists still clenched, and for a moment it seemed she might attack anyway, consequences be damned. Then Shala's voice, calmer than Vara's but equally firm, offered a different path. "We help here," Shala said, moving to kneel beside Crag near the fire. "Crag stays. We bring medicine to fire. We all tend him together." It was a compromise, one that allowed the strong females to reassert their importance while respecting Crag's choice. Vara's shoulders slowly lowered, her fists unclenching, though the fury in her eyes remained undimmed. She gave Nira one last look, a look that promised this was far from over, and then nodded curtly. For the rest of that day, the area around the fire pit became a center of intense activity. Shala sent gatherers to find specific plants, yarrow to pack into wounds, willow bark to chew for pain, certain types of moss that fought infection. Nira brought clean water from the stream, boiling it in a birch bark container by placing heated stones into the liquid. Vara herself prepared a poultice from rendered fat mixed with crushed herbs, which she spread across Krag's festering wound after Shala had cleaned it thoroughly. Through all of this, Nira remained exactly where she was, tending the fire, making sure it burned at exactly the right intensity to provide warmth without overheating the cave. She had become a piece of furniture, an obstacle that the other females worked around, neither acknowledging nor addressing directly. But she watched, and she learned. She saw how Shala cleaned the wound, how she packed it with fresh moss after applying the poultice, how she wrapped it carefully to keep dirt out, while still allowing air to reach the healing flesh. She saw how Nira boiled water using heated stones, a technique Nira had never seen before. She saw how Vara mixed the fat and herbs, grinding them together with a smooth stone until they formed a paste. As evening fell, Krag's fever finally began to break. His thrashing ceased, his breathing steadied, and the terrible, wild look left his eyes. He slept deeply for the first time in days, his massive chest rising and falling in a regular rhythm that suggested genuine rest rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. Shala sat back on her heels, satisfaction crossing her broad features. "Better," she announced. "He lives. Strong body fights rot." There was a collective exhale of relief throughout the cave. The crisis had passed, at least for now. Krag would survive, and with his survival the hierarchy could remain intact. The familiar order preserved. But something had changed, though most of the band could not quite articulate what. The clear divisions that had always existed, strong versus weak, important versus insignificant, valuable versus useless, had blurred slightly. Nira was still the smallest, still the weakest, still the most marginal member of the band, but she was no longer entirely invisible. The alpha male had chosen to position himself beside her fire, and that choice, irrational as it might seem, had created a kind of protection around her. As night deepened and the band settled into sleep, Nira fed the fire carefully, maintaining it at the perfect level to keep Krag warm without wasting precious fuel. Shala remained nearby, checking Krag's wound periodically, and for the first time since this strange situation had begun, she spoke directly to Nira. "Fire good," Shala said, her tone neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. "You keep steady. This helps healing." It was not praise exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and coming from one of the most powerful females in the band, it meant something. Nira ducked her head, unsure how to respond, and simply added another stick to the flames. Across the fire, Vara watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. She had not forgotten her rage, had not forgiven what she saw as Nira's theft of something that belonged to stronger, worthier females. But she was also intelligent enough to recognize that openly attacking Nira now, after Krag had been saved partly by the fire's warmth, would seem petty and might even turn others against her. So, Vara waited. She would bide her time, watch for an opportunity, wait for Nira to make a mistake that would justify the punishment Vara so desperately wanted to inflict, because eventually everyone made mistakes, and when Nira made hers, Vara would be ready. The days that followed brought subtle shifts in the band's dynamics. Krag continued to heal, though slowly. His broken arm would never be quite right again. The bone had set slightly crooked despite Torak's best efforts, and the muscles had begun to atrophy from disuse. His ribs knit together gradually, but the deep wound left an ugly scar that would mark him for the rest of his life. Through his recovery, he remained beside the fire. And as he grew stronger, more alert, the band began to notice something interesting. Krag watched Nira, not constantly, not obsessively, but regularly. He observed how she fed the fire, how she read the flames, how she anticipated exactly when fuel was needed. He watched her careful movements, her quiet efficiency, her absolute dedication to her single task. And sometimes when the strong females competed for his attention, Vara bringing him choice cuts of meat, Shala massaging his healing muscles, Nira offering her body for warmth during cold nights, Krag would accept their offerings with distracted grunts, his eyes drifting back to the small figure beside the fire, who never demanded anything, never competed, never made any claim on his attention at all. This observation did not escape the notice of the other females. They saw where his gaze went, saw what held his interest, and it baffled them even as it enraged them. What could possibly be interesting about Stick-Body Fire Girl? What could she offer that they could not? One evening, as the band shared a meal of roasted rabbit and early spring roots, Kessa approached Nira. Kessa was younger than Vara or Shala, but strong and capable, with quick hands and sharp eyes. She had always been neutral toward Nira before, neither kind nor cruel, simply indifferent as one might be toward a rock or a tree. But now Kessa sat down beside the firekeeper, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard, and her expression was curious rather than hostile. "Teach me," Kessa said simply, gesturing toward the fire. Nira's eyes widened in surprise. No one had ever asked her to teach anything before. Her knowledge of fire was specialized but not valued, a necessary skill that everyone assumed was simple enough that anyone could do it if they bothered. "Teach," Nira repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Kessa nodded. "Fire knowledge. How you make it never die, how you keep it steady. Orin old, soon gone. Then only you know. I want know too." It was a practical consideration. If both Orin and Nira died without passing on their knowledge, the band would face a terrible crisis. Fire could be maintained once lit, but creating new fire was difficult, requiring the right stones or the exhausting process of friction with wood. Better to ensure the flame never died, and that meant making sure more than one person knew the secrets of firekeeping. But Nira sensed something else beneath Kessa's request. By learning fire knowledge, Kessa would have a reason to spend time near the fire, near Crag, without seeming to compete directly with Vara and Shala. It was a clever strategy, one that used skill rather than strength to gain proximity to the alpha male. Still, Nira saw no reason to refuse. Teaching would give her a purpose beyond simply tending the flames, and perhaps having an ally, even one motivated by self-interest, might provide some protection against Vara's eventual revenge. "I teach," Nira said quietly. "You learn. Fire is life. Must respect. Must understand." Over the following days, as Crag continued his slow recovery, Nira began to teach Kessa the secrets of fire. She showed her how to read the color of smoke, to know if the wood was too green, or if the fire was getting enough air. She demonstrated how to arrange fuel so that flames could breathe and spread naturally. She explained the difference between woods that burned hot and fast versus those that produced long-lasting coals. Kessa proved an attentive student, her quick mind grasping concepts that others might have dismissed as unnecessary detail. And as word spread that Kessa was learning fire knowledge, 2 other younger females approached with similar requests. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, somewhat to her own amazement, Nira found herself at the center of a small group of students, females who wanted to acquire the knowledge that might give them value beyond physical strength or childbearing. It was not a challenge to the existing hierarchy. Vara and Shala and the other strong females remained firmly in control of the band's important decisions, but it represented a subtle shift, a recognition that different types of knowledge and skill had worth. Vara watched these developments with growing unease. She was not stupid. She could see what was happening, could see how Nira's position was slowly solidifying from merely tolerated to actually necessary. As long as Nira was the only one who truly understood fire, as long as Crag remained positioned beside those flames, the small firekeeper could not simply be eliminated. But Vara was patient. She had survived for over 30 winters in a world that killed the weak and the careless. She knew how to wait, how to watch for the right moment, and she knew with absolute certainty that eventually that moment would come. Everyone made mistakes. Even Nira would make one eventually. And when she did, Vara would be ready. 2 full cycles of the moon passed, and Crag was finally able to stand without assistance. His body had healed as much as it ever would. The broken arm remained weak and crooked, limiting his ability to throw a spear with his former power, and the scar along his ribs pulled tight whenever he twisted too quickly. But he was alive, and he was mobile, and that meant he could resume some semblance of leadership. The first time Crag rose to his feet, the entire band gathered to watch. There was a collective holding of breath as he pushed himself up with his good arm, his face contorting with effort and pain. For a moment he swayed, his legs uncertain after so long lying down, and Shala moved forward instinctively to steady him. But Crag waved her away with a grunt, determined to stand on his own. When he finally straightened to his full height, a sound rippled through the band. Relief, joy, and for some, renewed calculation. The alpha male had survived. The hierarchy remained intact. Life could return to normal, except it could not entirely, because Crag, even standing strong again, did not move away from the fire. He remained within its circle, within the space that had become associated with Nira's presence. And when he began to take short walks to rebuild his strength, he would always return to sit beside the flames, watching them dance, watching the small firekeeper tend them with her careful, efficient movements. Spring arrived in earnest. bringing warmer days and the return of migratory herds. The hunting improved dramatically, and the band's food stores grew abundant. With full bellies and safer weather, tensions that had been suppressed during Crag's recovery began to surface more openly. Vara had watched and waited long enough. She had seen her position erode slightly as other females learned fire knowledge, had endured the inexplicable situation of Crag remaining beside the weakest member of the band, had swallowed her rage day after day. But patience had its limits, and Vara's had been exceeded. She chose her moment carefully, a warm afternoon when Crag had gone with Torak and several other males to scout a valley where mammoth had been spotted. The hunters would be gone until evening, perhaps longer if they found good signs. That left the cave under the nominal authority of the females, with Vara at their head. Nira was sitting beside the fire, as always, working on a new technique she had discovered, weaving thin strips of green willow into a tight basket that could hold embers without catching fire itself. If successful, it would allow them to transport fire more safely when the band needed to move to new territory. Several of her students sat nearby, watching her demonstrate the weaving pattern. Vara approached with Shala and Nira flanking her, their faces set in identical expressions of grim determination. The other females in the cave noticed immediately and began to gather, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the children quieted, their instincts warning them of danger. "Fire girl," Vara said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Stand up." Nira's hands stilled on the willow basket. Her heart began to hammer in her chest. Slowly, she set the basket aside and rose to her feet, her thin legs trembling slightly. Even standing, she barely came up to Vara's shoulder. "You think you are important now," Vara continued, her voice carrying across the cave. "You think because Crag sits by fire you are special. You think because females learn from you you have power." Nira shook her head quickly, desperately. "No, I think nothing. I only tend fire. That is all." "Liar," Shala spat. "We see how you look at him. We see how you sit close. You try to take what you have no right to take." "I take nothing." Nira's voice cracked with fear. "I only—" Vara's hand shot out, faster than Nira could react, and grabbed the firekeeper by her thin arm. The grip was crushing, painful, and Vara lifted Nira partly off her feet with casual ease. "You are weak," Vara said, her face very close to Nira's now. "You are nothing, and it is time you remember your place." She released Nira with a shove that sent the small female stumbling backward. Nira caught herself before falling, but barely. "Shala," Vara said, turning to the other powerful female. "Show Fire Girl what strength means." Shala stepped forward, rolling her thick shoulders. She was not cruel by nature. She had no particular desire to hurt Nira, but the hierarchy had to be maintained, and demonstrations of dominance were a normal part of band life. The strong reminded the weak of their place, and this prevented more serious conflicts from erupting. "Come," Shala said to Nira, gesturing to an open area away from the fire. "We test. You push me. Try to move me. Show strength." It was ritual combat, not meant to cause real injury, but to establish physical dominance clearly. Nira had seen it performed dozens of times between other females, usually ending quickly when the weaker one submitted. But she had never been forced to participate before. She had always been so obviously inferior that no one bothered to test her. Now, with nowhere to run and the entire band watching, Nira walked on shaking legs to face Shala. The difference between them was almost comical. Shala stood solid as a boulder, her thick body radiating power. Nira looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. "Push!" Shala commanded. Nira placed her thin hands against Shala's shoulders and pushed. She might as well have been pushing against the cave wall. Shala did not move even slightly. She simply stood there, immovable, while Nira strained with all her pathetic strength. After a few moments, Shala snorted with derision. "My turn." She placed one hand against Nira's chest and pushed, not hard, not enough to truly hurt, but with enough force to send Nira flying backward. The small firekeeper landed hard on the cave floor, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. "Again," Vara commanded. "Stand up." Nira struggled to her feet, gasping for breath. Her chest ached where Shala had pushed her, and she knew a bruise was already forming. "Push!" Shala said again. The ritual repeated. Nira pushed uselessly against Shala's immobile form, and then Shala pushed back, sending Nira tumbling to the ground once more, and again, and again. Each time, the message became clearer. "You are weak. We are strong. Remember your place." By the fifth repetition, Nira could barely stand. Her thin arms trembled with exhaustion. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and tears of humiliation streamed down her hollow cheeks. But Vara was not finished. "Mira," Vara said. "Your turn." Mira stepped forward, and the ritual began again. Push uselessly, be pushed down. Stand, push uselessly, be pushed down. Over and over, with different females taking turns. First Mira, then Kessa, then Lena, then others. Even some of Nira's own students participated, unable to refuse without challenging Vara's authority. The firekeeper's body began to fail. Her legs would not hold her properly anymore. Her arms hung limp at her sides. Blood trickled from her nose where she had landed face first during one fall, and her lips were split and swelling. But still Vara made her stand, made her try, made her fail. "Enough," old Orin's voice cut through the proceedings. He had been sitting silently in his usual spot, but now he struggled to his feet, his ancient body moving with painful slowness. "She understands. All understand. This is enough." Vara turned her cold gaze on the old firekeeper. For a moment, it seemed she might order him to sit down, might continue the punishment despite his objection. But Orin had been with the band longer than anyone, had survived more winters than seemed possible, and his words still carried some weight. "Maybe enough," Vara agreed slowly. Then she looked down at Nira, who knelt on the cave floor, unable to rise again. "But Fire Girl must say it, must say what she is." Nira's vision swam with pain and exhaustion. She could barely form words through her split lips. But she understood what was required. She had to submit completely, had to acknowledge her place at the very bottom of the hierarchy, or the punishment would continue. "I am weak," Nira whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I am nothing, I am lowest." "Louder!" Vara demanded. "I am weak," Nira cried out, her voice breaking. "I am nothing, I am lowest." Vara nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Fire Girl remembers. Now stay down. Stay there until you can stand. Then go back to fire. Do your small work. Forget big ideas." The gathered females began to disperse, the entertainment over. Some looked satisfied, others uncomfortable. A few appeared thoughtful. Nira remained on the floor, too battered and exhausted to move, while her students quietly returned to their own tasks, none of them meeting her eyes. Only Orin approached, shuffling slowly until he stood beside the broken firekeeper. He lowered himself carefully to sit on the ground next to her, his old bones creaking with the effort. "Listen," he whispered, his voice so low that only Nira could hear. "You think you have learned about fire, about reading flames, about feeding wood, about keeping warmth, but you have not learned the most important lesson." Nira turned her head slightly to look at him, one eye already swelling shut. "Fire is not strongest thing," Orin continued. "Wind is stronger, can blow out flame. Water is stronger, can drown fire. Stone is stronger, cannot burn. But fire has something they do not." He paused, making sure she was listening despite her pain. "Fire has persistence. Fire does not need to be strongest to survive. It only needs to refuse to die. Feed it small sticks, it lives. Feed it careful, patient, constant, it grows. Not fast like wind, not heavy like stone, but always there, always burning. That is fire's strength." Nira's unswollen eye focused on the old firekeeper's face. Through her pain, she tried to understand what he was telling her. "You are fire," Orin said simply. "Not strong, not fast, not heavy. But you keep burning. They can knock you down, but you get up. They can hurt you, but you do not go out. That is your strength, only strength you need." He fell silent then, and after a few moments, he began the slow process of standing up again. Nira watched him shuffle back to his place near the warmth, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand. She would never be strong like Vara. She would never bear children like Shala. She would never hunt or fight or carry heavy loads. But she could persist. She could refuse to die. She could keep burning no matter how many times they tried to extinguish her. As the sun began to set, Nira finally managed to pull herself to her feet. Every part of her body screamed with pain. Her face was a swollen mass of bruises. Her arms and legs ached from the repeated falls, and her spirit felt crushed beneath the weight of humiliation. But she walked back to the fire. Step by painful step, she returned to her place. And when she sat down beside the flames, she picked up the willow basket she had been working on and continued weaving. Her hands shook, and tears kept blurring her vision. But she did not stop. She fed the fire when it needed feeding. She adjusted the wood when adjustment was needed. She did her work. When Crag returned from scouting as darkness fell, he saw immediately what had happened. Nira's battered face told the story clearly enough. His expression darkened, and he looked around the cave until his eyes found Vara. For a long moment, alpha male and dominant female locked gazes, and something unspoken passed between them. Then Crag walked to the fire and sat down in his usual place, his massive form settling beside Nira's small broken one. He did not speak to her, did not touch her, did not acknowledge the injuries she had sustained. But his presence there, returned to the fire despite everything, made a statement that everyone in the cave understood. Whatever Vara had tried to prove, whatever message she had tried to send, Crag had countered it with his choice. He remained beside the fire. He remained beside the firekeeper. That night, as Nira fed the flames with trembling hands, she thought about Orin's words. Fire did not need to be the strongest to survive. It only needed to refuse to die. To burn steadily, patiently, persistently, no matter what tried to extinguish it. She touched the willow basket she had been making, running her fingers over the tight weave. It was nearly finished now, designed to carry embers safely from one place to another, to transport fire across distances, to ensure the flame never died even when the band had to move. A basket to protect fire, a container to keep it alive. She was building her own protection, she realized. Not through strength or fighting, but through making herself necessary in ways that went beyond simply sitting beside flames. The more knowledge she shared, the more techniques she developed, the more she became woven into the fabric of the band's survival, the harder it would be to simply eliminate her. It was a fragile protection, as fragile as she was, but it was something. And unlike the strength that Vara possessed, strength that would fade with age, that could be lost to injury, that could be challenged by younger, stronger rivals, the knowledge Nira carried would only grow more valuable with time. She fed another stick into the fire, watching it catch and burn. The flames danced up bright and warm and alive, persistent, refusing to die, just like her. Across the fire, Vara watched with narrowed eyes. The beating had been satisfying, a necessary reminder of the natural order, but Crag's return to the fire, his implicit rejection of the message Vara had tried to send, troubled her deeply. She had broken Nira's body easily enough, but she had not broken whatever strange connection existed between the fragile firekeeper and the alpha male. That connection remained, inexplicable and infuriating, like a thorn lodged too deep to remove, without causing more damage than the thorn itself. Vara was beginning to realize that simple violence might not be enough. Nira could be beaten, humiliated, pushed to the very edge of death, but as long as she kept the fire burning, as long as Crag chose to sit beside those flames, she would survive. A different approach would be needed, something more permanent, something that would remove the firekeeper without appearing to challenge Crag's authority. Vara did not know what that would be yet, but she would find it. She was patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to restoring the natural order that had been so inexplicably disrupted. The fire crackled. Nira fed it another stick. Crag's breathing grew steady as he drifted into sleep, and Vara watched, planning, waiting for the opportunity that would surely come, because everyone made mistakes eventually, even firekeepers. The bruises on Nira's face faded slowly over the following weeks, the purple and black giving way to sickly yellow-green, before finally disappearing into her pale skin. But something inside her had changed, had hardened like clay baked in fire. She moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was a new quality to her silence, not submission exactly, but a kind of stubborn endurance that had not been there before. She completed the ember basket and immediately began making a second one, then a third. She taught the weaving technique to her students, showing them how to select the right willows, how to soak them until they were pliable, how to weave them tight enough to contain heat without catching fire. The baskets were practical, useful, and they represented a tangible contribution to the band's survival that even Vara could not dismiss. Crag's arm healed as much as it would ever heal, which meant it remained permanently weakened. He could no longer throw a spear with his former deadly accuracy, could no longer wrestle rival males with both arms, could no longer perform many of the feats of strength that had originally established his dominance. Yet his position as alpha male remained secure, held in place by the respect he had earned over many seasons and by the lack of any clear challenger willing to risk a confrontation. But everyone knew that this situation was temporary. Eventually, Torak or another strong male would test Crag's weakened state. Eventually, the hierarchy would shift, and when it did, everything would change again. The late spring sun rose warm and bright one morning, promising a perfect day for gathering. The berry bushes would be flowering now, and the females would need to harvest the early shoots before the animals stripped them bare. Vara organized a large gathering party. Nearly every able-bodied female would go, along with several of the older children who could carry baskets. Nira prepared to join them, as she always did when the band went gathering. Fire could be banked during the day, covered with ash to preserve the coals until someone returned to revive it. It was the only time she ever left the cave for more than a brief walk to relieve herself or fetch water. But as the gathering party assembled near the cave entrance, Vara turned and looked directly at Nira. "Fire girl stays," Vara announced. "Someone must watch Fire. Old Orin too weak now. Fire girl stays." It was not an unreasonable request. Someone should remain with the fire, particularly when most of the band would be gone for hours. But Nira felt a chill run down her spine nonetheless. Something in Vara's eyes, some calculation in her expression, suggested this was more than simple practicality. "I can bank fire," Nira said quietly. "Cover with ash. Fire sleeps safely until—" "No," Vara interrupted, her voice sharp. "Fire must stay awake, must stay strong. You teach us this. Fire that sleeps might die. So Fire Girl stays awake, stays watching." Several of Nira's students looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances with one another. They understood fire well enough now to know that properly banked flames were perfectly safe for a day's absence, but none of them were willing to contradict Vara directly. Crag stood near the cave entrance with Torak and the other males, preparing for their own departure to hunt. He looked at Vara, then at Nira, his heavy brow furrowed with thought, but he said nothing. Hunting parties needed to leave early to make the most of the daylight, and he had already delayed their departure, while the gathering party organized themselves. With a final glance at the fire, Crag turned and led the hunters down the slope. The gathering party followed shortly after, their voices fading as they moved toward the berry fields in the distance. Nira was left alone in the cave, with only old Orin and two small children, who were too young to gather or hunt. The sudden silence felt oppressive, heavy with implications she could not quite grasp. "You see it?" Orin's raspy voice came from his place near the wall. "See what?" Nira asked, though she feared she knew. "Trap," Orin said simply. "Vara makes trap." Nira felt her chest tighten with anxiety. "What trap?" "I stay with fire. I do what she asks." Orin's milky eyes stared at nothing, but his voice carried certainty. "She wants you to fail, wants fire to die while you watch it. Then she can say you are useless, can say you cannot do only thing you do, can make Crag see you have no value." The logic was cruel but sound. If Nira somehow let the fire die while she was specifically told to keep it alive, while she was left behind for that exact purpose, it would be an unforgivable failure. The band would return to a cold cave, no flames to cook their food or warm them through the night, and all of the blame would fall on the firekeeper who had one job and failed at it. "But I will not fail," Nira said, trying to convince herself as much as Orin. "I know fire, I understand fire, I will keep it alive." "Yes," Orin agreed, "you will keep it alive. That is what she fears. So she will make it difficult." Before Nira could ask what he meant, she heard a sound from the cave entrance. She turned to see one of the older children, a boy of perhaps 8 winters named Dak, standing there with an armload of wood, but not the right kind of wood. Every piece was green, freshly cut from living trees, still damp with sap. This wood would barely burn at all. It would smoke terribly, would smother the flames rather than feed them, would turn the fire into a smoldering, struggling mess that would be difficult to maintain and might easily go out entirely. "Vara says use this wood," Dak announced, dumping the green branches near the fire pit. "Says Fire Girl must use only this, no other wood." Nira's heart sank as she looked at the pile. There was enough dry wood stacked nearby to last several days, carefully selected and prepared over many weeks. But if Vara had given explicit orders that only the green wood could be used, then using the dry wood would be seen as disobedience, another kind of failure. The trap was clear now. Keep the fire alive using only wood that would barely burn. Succeed, and she would have proven her skill but also exhausted herself managing an impossibly difficult task. Fail, and she would be exposed as incompetent, her one claim to usefulness destroyed. Dak stood there awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with his role in this scheme, but too young and powerless to refuse Vara's orders. After a moment, he turned and hurried out of the cave, leaving Nira alone with her impossible task. "What do I do?" Nira whispered, staring at the green wood with despair. "You keep fire alive," Orin said. "However you can. That is only thing that matters. Fire must not die." Nira took a deep breath and approached the pile of green branches. She selected the thinnest pieces first, the ones that might have a chance of drying and burning if given enough heat. She arranged them carefully around the edge of the fire pit, where the existing flames could begin to drive out their moisture. The wood hissed and popped as sap boiled out of it. Thick white smoke rose from the branches, making Nira's eyes water and her throat burn. The fire itself began to struggle, the flames diminishing as they fought against the wet, resistant fuel. For the next several hours, Nira worked constantly. She could not simply pile wood onto the fire as she normally would. Instead, she had to coax and nurture every piece, positioning them to dry before they burned, using the heat of the existing fire to prepare the next piece of fuel. She blew on the flames when they threatened to go out. She adjusted branches with her bare hands despite the heat. She scraped away ash that built up too quickly from the smoking green wood. Her eyes streamed with tears from the smoke. Her lungs ached from breathing the acrid fumes. Her hands began to blister from handling the hot green branches. But she did not stop. She could not stop. The fire had to stay alive. By midday, she had managed to establish a kind of rhythm. The fire was not healthy. It struggled and smoked and gave off far less heat than normal. But it lived. She fed it carefully, constantly, never letting her attention waver for even a moment. Old Orin watched from his place against the wall, his expression unreadable. The two small children played quietly in the corner, occasionally glancing toward Nira with wide, curious eyes. The cave grew thick with smoke despite the breeze from the entrance, and Nira's thin form was barely visible through the grey haze. As the afternoon wore on, Nira began to understand something about fire that she had not fully grasped before. Fire wanted to live. It was not passive, not simply a tool to be used. It had its own kind of will, its own determination to continue burning. All she had to do was give it the smallest chance, the tiniest opportunity, and it would fight to survive. She was not keeping the fire alive through her own strength. She was working with the fire, partnering with it, understanding what it needed, and providing just enough for it to sustain itself. It was collaboration, not domination. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Nira was trembling with exhaustion. She had not eaten all day, had barely drunk any water, and every breath hurt from the smoke she had inhaled. But the fire still burned, weak, smoking, struggling but alive. She heard voices approaching from outside the cave. The gathering party was returning, their baskets full of berry shoots and early roots, their voices cheerful after a successful day. Nira felt a surge of anxiety mixed with defiant pride. Let them see. Let Vara see. The fire lived. Vara entered the cave first, her eyes going immediately to the fire pit. She saw the smoke, saw the struggling flames, saw Nira's blistered hands and tear-streaked face. For just a moment, something like disappointment crossed her features. She had expected failure, had planned for failure, and here was the firekeeper, battered but successful. "Fire lives," Vara said flatly, as if commenting on the weather. "Fire lives," Nira confirmed, her voice hoarse from smoke. The other females filed in, coughing as they encountered the thick smoke that filled the cave. They set down their baskets and began to complain about the air quality, the poor fire, the inadequate heat for cooking. "Fire girl uses bad wood," Shala observed, picking up one of the green branches with disgust. "Why? Good wood is there." She gestured to the stack of dry fuel that Nira had not been permitted to use. "Vara told her to use only green wood." Orin's voice came from the shadows. "Vara's orders. Fire girl obeys." Several of the females turned to look at Vara, comprehension dawning on their faces. They understood now. This had been a test, perhaps an impossible one, and somehow Nira had passed it. The firekeeper might be weak in body, might be the lowest member of the hierarchy, but her understanding of fire was real, was valuable, was perhaps irreplaceable. Vara's jaw tightened. She had underestimated the firekeeper, had assumed that physical weakness meant weakness in all things, but watching fire required different skills: patience, attention, understanding of something beyond simple force. And in that specialized domain, weak little Nira was not weak at all. "Fire is alive," Vara finally said, her voice grudging. "Fire girl succeeds. This is enough." She turned away, dismissing the situation, but Nira could see the calculation in her eyes. This had not worked. The trap had failed. Vara would need to think of something else. When the hunting party returned at dusk, Crag entered the cave and immediately noticed the smoke, the struggling fire, the exhausted firekeeper. He looked at the green wood, at Nira's blistered hands, at the defiant little flame that refused to die. Then he looked at Vara, and something passed between them. A question and an answer, an understanding and a warning. Crag walked to the fire and, without a word, began selecting pieces from the stack of dry wood. He fed them to the flames carefully, helping Nira rebuild the fire properly, giving it what it needed to burn strong and clean again. The smoke began to clear. The flames rose higher. The heat increased. It was a simple action, but it carried enormous meaning. The alpha male was helping the firekeeper, acknowledging her success, supporting her against whatever test had been imposed. He was making his position clear yet again, through actions rather than words. Nira felt tears prick her already burning eyes, but these were different tears, not from smoke or pain, but from something she could not quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the overwhelming relief of surviving another impossible day. As the fire grew strong again, properly fed at last, Nira allowed herself to slump slightly against the cave wall. Her body screamed with exhaustion, her hands throbbed with pain, her lungs felt seared from the inside, but she had done it. She had kept the fire alive against all odds, against green wood and smoke and the trap that had been set for her. She had persisted. Like fire itself, she had refused to die. Crag sat down beside the fire in his usual place, his massive form settling with a grunt of satisfaction. He glanced at Nira, his heavy features unreadable, and then he did something he had never done before. He reached out with his good hand and, very gently, very briefly, touched her thin shoulder. Just once. A gesture that lasted only a heartbeat, but it was acknowledgement, it was recognition, it was connection. Then he withdrew his hand and turned his attention to the food that Shala was preparing, and the moment passed as if it had never been. But Nira felt it still, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the warmth of his touch, the message that had been conveyed without words. You did well, you have value, you survive. Across the fire, Vara watched this exchange with eyes that had gone cold and dead as winter stones. The touching was new. That single gesture represented a shift, a deepening of whatever incomprehensible bond existed between the alpha male and the worthless firekeeper. Vara had tried violence. She had tried humiliation. She had tried impossible tests. And still, Nira remained. Still, Crag chose to sit beside her fire. Still, the natural order refused to reassert itself. Patience was no longer enough. Subtlety was not working. Direct confrontation had failed to produce results. What remained was something more drastic, something more permanent, something that would solve the problem once and for all, without leaving any possibility of survival or persistence. Vara's mind began to work on a new plan, a final plan, one that would remove the firekeeper from the equation entirely, not through challenge or test or demonstration of dominance, but through simple elimination, an accident, a tragedy. The kind of thing that happens sometimes in a harsh world where the weak did not survive. It would require careful timing and careful planning, but Vara was both patient and intelligent. Even in her fury, she would find the way. She would create the opportunity. And when she did, the firekeeper would finally learn the ultimate lesson about strength and weakness. Some flames, no matter how persistent, could be extinguished forever. The fire crackled and danced, unaware of the dark thoughts surrounding it. Nira fed it another piece of dry wood, grateful beyond measure to be using proper fuel again. The flames leaped up, bright and warm and alive, pushing back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. But some darkness, she would soon learn, came from within the cave itself, and that was the most dangerous darkness of all. The full moon rose enormous and pale over the eastern ridge, casting the valley in silver light. It was the kind of night when predators hunted with confidence, when prey animals stayed hidden in their dens, when the boundary between light and shadow seemed sharper, more absolute. Inside the cave, the fire burned steadily, its warm glow mixing with the cold moonlight that spilled through the entrance. 3 days had passed since Nira's trial with the green wood, and life had returned to its rhythms. The gathering continued, the hunting went well, and the band enjoyed a period of relative plenty. The young ones played without fear, the elders dozed in the sun, and tensions that had run so high during Crag's recovery seemed to have eased into a comfortable routine. But Nira could feel something wrong in the air. It was nothing she could point to exactly. No open threats, no hostile glances more intense than usual. But Vara had grown too quiet, too calm, too seemingly accepting of the situation. A female who had been volcanic in her rage just weeks ago now moved through the cave with serene purpose, and that transformation worried Nira far more than the earlier fury had. Old Orin felt it too. He had taken to staying awake longer into the evenings, his milky eyes tracking movements around the cave, his gnarled hands restless in his lap. Once, when Nira was adjusting the fire late at night, he reached out and gripped her thin wrist with surprising strength. "Be careful," he whispered. "Storm comes, I feel it." "What storm?" Nira asked, glancing toward the cave entrance where stars shone clear in a cloudless sky. "Not weather storm," Orin said. "Worse, human storm. When humans decide someone must go, storms come. You watch. You be ready." Nira nodded, but she did not know how to be ready for something she could not see or predict. All she could do was continue her work, tend the fire, teach her students, contribute what small value she possessed, and hope it would be enough. On the night of the full moon, Vara announced that she would lead a night-gathering expedition. The moonlight was bright enough to see by, and certain tubers were easier to find at night when they released their scent more strongly. It was unusual but not unheard of. The band sometimes took advantage of full moon nights to extend their gathering time. "Strong females come," Vara announced. "Shala, Mira, Lena, Kessa. We bring back much food." The females she named gathered their baskets and digging sticks. They would go to a field about an hour's walk from the cave, work quickly while the moon was high, and return before dawn. Crag and the other males were settled in for the night, bellies full from a successful deer hunt, content to let the females work without supervision. As the gathering party prepared to leave, Vara paused beside the fire. She looked down at Nira with an expression that might have been concern, might have been something else entirely. "Fire girl should sleep tonight," Vara said, her voice almost kind. "Fire is strong. Fire will last. You work too hard. Rest." Nira felt that familiar chill run down her spine. The words were considerate, but the tone held something underneath, something calculated. "I rest when fire sleeps," Nira said carefully. "Fire does not sleep tonight." Vara shrugged, as if it did not matter. "As you want, but do not exhaust yourself. Band needs firekeeper healthy." Then she turned and led the gathering party out into the moonlit night, their shadows stretching long across the frost-touched ground before they disappeared into the valley below. The cave fell quiet, except for the crackle of flames and the soft breathing of sleeping band members. Crag lay in his usual place beside the fire, his massive chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Torak and the other males were scattered around the cave in their preferred sleeping spots. The children huddled together in a pile of warmth and limbs. Old Orin sat against his wall, appearing to doze but possibly listening to everything. Nira fed the fire and tried to shake off her sense of unease. Perhaps Vara really had accepted the situation. Perhaps the rage had burned itself out, leaving only resignation. Perhaps everything would be all right. But then she heard something that made her blood freeze. A sound from outside the cave, not from the direction the gathering party had gone, but from the opposite side, from the steep cliffs that formed the northern wall of their shelter. A sound like rock scraping against rock, like something heavy being moved with deliberate care. Nira stood and moved quietly toward the cave entrance, staying in the shadows. The moonlight was so bright it was almost like day, and she could see the landscape clearly. The valley below, the ridge to the east, the cliffs to the north. And there, on those cliffs, she saw movement. 4 figures, climbing carefully, working their way along a ledge that ran above the cave. 4 female figures, recognizable even at this distance by their builds and movements. Vara, Shala, Mira, and Lena. They had not gone to gather tubers at all. They had circled around to reach the cliffs above the cave, and now they were positioning themselves directly over the entrance. Nira's heart began to hammer as she understood. The ledge above the cave entrance was unstable. Everyone knew it. Large rocks sat precariously balanced there, held in place by friction and luck, but capable of falling if disturbed. The band was always careful not to make loud noises or vibrations near that area, always mindful of the danger above their heads. But if someone deliberately loosened those rocks, if someone pushed them at just the right moment, they would fall directly into the cave entrance. They would crush anything in their path, and if someone happened to be standing near the entrance at the time, someone small and fragile, perhaps drawn outside by a noise or some other lure, that person would be killed instantly. An accident, a tragedy, the kind of thing that happened in a dangerous world. No one to blame, no punishment necessary. Just the sad reality that weak members of the band sometimes died in unfortunate ways. Nira backed away from the entrance, her mind racing. She had to warn someone, had to wake Crag or Torak or someone who could stop this. But if she made noise, if she caused a commotion, would that trigger the rockfall early? Would it bring death down on everyone near the entrance, including the children who slept there? And if she accused Vara without proof, if she claimed the dominant female was trying to murder her, who would believe the worthless firekeeper over the strong hunter-gatherer who had served the band faithfully for decades? Nira looked at the fire, and suddenly Orin's words came back to her with new meaning. Fire is not strongest thing, but fire has persistence. Fire does not need to be strongest to survive. Fire also had another quality, she realized. Fire could spread, fire could grow, fire could become something much larger and more powerful than its origins suggested. She moved quickly, quietly gathering materials, dry grasses from the bedding areas, thin sticks from the fuel pile, strips of birch bark that would catch and burn easily. She arranged them in a pile near the cave entrance, just inside the shelter but clearly visible to anyone watching from above. Then she took one of the ember baskets she had woven, filled it with hot coals from the fire, and carried it toward the entrance. As she moved, she made sure to stay visible in the moonlight, to let the watchers above see her thin figure approaching the exact spot where they wanted her to be. She set the basket down on top of the pile of tinder she had prepared. Then, very deliberately, she backed away, retreating deeper into the cave but keeping her eyes on the entrance. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from above, she heard Vara's voice, sharp, commanding, urgent. The sound of rocks being shifted, of weight being applied, of gravity being given permission to do its deadly work. The rockfall was catastrophic. Boulders the size of a human body crashed down from the ledge above, slamming into the cave entrance with tremendous force. The sound was like thunder echoing through the valley, shaking dust from the cave ceiling. More rocks followed, dozens of them, hundreds, creating a cascade of stone that completely blocked the entrance with a wall of rubble. But the rocks fell exactly where Nira had not been standing. They fell onto the pile of tinder and the basket of coals she had deliberately positioned there. And within moments, despite the crushing weight of stone, fire found its way through the gaps between boulders. The dry materials she had placed caught immediately, and flames began to leap up through the rockfall, feeding on the fuel she had provided, growing larger and brighter with each passing moment. The crash had woken everyone in the cave. Crag was on his feet instantly despite his injuries, his eyes wide as he took in the blocked entrance and the fire now burning in the rubble. Torak and the other males grabbed their spears, ready to defend against whatever threat had caused this disaster. The children wailed in terror, and the elders called out in confusion. But Nira stood calm amid the chaos, her eyes fixed on the entrance. She could see shadows moving above the cave in the moonlight, the 4 females who had caused the rockfall, now frozen in shock as they watched flames erupt from the rubble, instead of finding a crushed body beneath it. "The entrance is blocked," Torak shouted, stating the obvious. "We are trapped." "No," Nira said quietly, her voice somehow carrying through the confusion. She pointed to the back of the cave, to a narrow passage that most of the band had forgotten existed. "There is another way, old way, small, but we can pass." Orin's cackling laugh rose from his place against the wall. "Fire Girl remembers. Old Firekeeper shows her long ago, when Cave was new to this band. Emergency exit, in case of cave bear or other danger. Small people pass easy. Big people squeeze through." Crag moved to Nira's side, his heavy brow furrowed. "Show me," he commanded. Nira led him to the back passage, holding a burning stick for light. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for Crag's shoulders, and it twisted through the rock for the length of several body lengths before emerging on the side of the cliff, hidden by brush and easily missed if you did not know it was there. Crag examined the passage and nodded slowly. Then he looked down at Nira, and his eyes were full of questions. How did she know the entrance would be blocked? How did she know to prepare fire at exactly that spot? How did she know to remember the emergency passage at exactly the right moment? But he did not ask these questions aloud. Instead, he simply gestured for her to lead the way, to show the rest of the band how to escape the trap that had been set for one, but had endangered all. As the band began to file through the narrow passage, helping the children and elders squeeze through the tight spaces, Nira glanced back one last time at the blocked entrance. The fire she had planted there burned bright and fierce now, flames leaping high into the night, visible from a great distance. A signal, a beacon, a message to those who had tried to crush her. I persist. I adapt. I survive. Outside the cave, Vara and her accomplices scrambled down from the cliffs, their minds racing to construct an explanation for what had happened. They would claim they had been gathering nearby when they heard the rock fall, when they came running to help. They would express shock and concern about the blocked entrance. They would offer assistance in clearing the rubble. But when they reached the cave entrance and saw the band emerging from the side passage, saw everyone safe and accounted for, saw Nira standing beside Crag with that same quiet persistence she always showed, Vara's face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, confusion, rage, and finally something like fear, because she understood now what Nira had become. Not strong, not powerful, not dominant in any traditional sense, but impossible to eliminate, impossible to extinguish, like fire itself, adapting to survive, finding ways through obstacles, persisting despite every attempt to smother it. Crag's voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. Who loosened rocks? The question hung in the moonlit air. Everyone looked at the cliffs, at the fresh marks where boulders had been pried from their resting places, at the clear evidence of deliberate action. Then everyone looked at Vara and the three females with her, standing right there near the rockfall, appearing at exactly the wrong moment to claim innocence. We were gathering, Vara said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying uncertainty. We heard crash. We came to help. In wrong direction. Old Orin's voice came from where he had emerged from the side passage. Gathering fields are east. You come from north, from cliff direction. Why? Vara's mouth opened, then closed. She had no good answer, no explanation that would not sound like a lie. Shala and Mira and Lena stood frozen beside her, their faces showing their guilt as clearly as if they had confessed aloud. Crag looked at them for a long moment, his face unreadable in the mixed light of moon and fire. Then he looked at Nira, at the small firekeeper who had somehow anticipated the attack, who had prepared for it, who had survived it, and saved the entire band in the process. Then Crag did something unprecedented in the history of the band. He turned his back on Vara, completely, deliberately, unmistakably. It was a gesture of ultimate dismissal, a removal of recognition and respect. By turning his back, he was saying clearer than words could, "You are nothing to me now. You have no status. You are beneath my notice." And then he walked to Nira and placed himself beside her, not near the fire. The fire still burned in the rubble at the blocked entrance. He stood beside Nira herself, making the choice explicit and undeniable, not the flames but the firekeeper, not the warmth but the one who created and protected and sustained that warmth. The other males watched this and understood. Slowly, one by one, they moved to stand with Crag. Torak first, then Grok, then Dren, and the younger hunters. They formed a line beside the alpha male, beside the firekeeper, making their allegiance clear. And then, after a moment of hesitation, the females began to move as well. Not Vara's former allies, Shala, Mira, and Lena stood frozen, uncertain, their loyalty divided between old associations and present reality. But Kessa moved to join those standing with Nira, then several of Nira's students, then others, younger females who had watched the strong ones try repeatedly to crush someone who had done nothing wrong, who contributed what she could, who simply refused to die despite having every reason to give up. Within moments, the band had physically divided itself into two groups. The larger group stood with Crag and Nira, most of the hunters, many of the females, all of the children who understood that the firekeeper was the one who kept them warm at night. The smaller group stood with Vara, just her three accomplices and a handful of others who were too frightened or too loyal to abandon their former leader. It was a schism, a breaking of the social order, the kind of division that could destroy a hunter-gatherer band entirely. Groups this size could not survive split in two. There were not enough hunters, not enough gatherers, not enough adults to protect the young and care for the old if they separated. One side would have to yield. One side would have to submit. One side would have to acknowledge defeat and accept the new hierarchy that was forming in the moonlight. Vara looked at the line of band members standing with Crag, at the undeniable message of their positioning, at the complete collapse of her status and authority. For a long moment, her face was a mask of such rage and pain that Nira thought she might attack anyway, might choose violence even knowing it would mean her own death or exile. But Vara had survived for over 30 winters by being intelligent, by knowing when to fight and when to submit, by understanding that persistence meant knowing when to bend rather than break. She had tried to crush Nira and had failed. She had tried to eliminate the problem and had only made it worse. And now she faced a choice: accept the new order or leave the band entirely. Slowly, with visible effort, Vara's shoulders lowered, her fists unclenched, her face smoothed into something resembling neutrality, though her eyes remained hard as stone. She walked forward, alone, and stopped in front of Crag. For a long moment, they stared at each other, former allies, former partners in leadership, now alpha male and demoted female. Then Vara did what had to be done. She lowered her head in submission, acknowledging his dominance, accepting his authority, yielding to his choice. And then, in a gesture that cost her everything, she turned to Nira and lowered her head to the small firekeeper as well. Not as low, not as completely, but enough. A recognition that Nira had won, that persistence had triumphed over strength, that the firekeeper had earned her place beside the alpha male through survival rather than combat. The band exhaled collectively, tension draining away now that the crisis had been resolved without bloodshed. Shala and the other females who had stood with Vara quickly moved to join the main group, their expressions showing relief that they would not be exiled or punished for their role in the attack. Krag gestured toward the blocked entrance and made sounds that everyone understood. Clear it, make it safe, restore the cave. The males immediately set to work, using their strength to roll away the largest boulders, creating an opening large enough to pass through. As they worked, Nira moved to tend the fire that still burned in the rubble. She carefully retrieved coals and rebuilt a proper fire pit just inside the cleared entrance, establishing warmth and light in their restored shelter. Her hands moved with their usual efficiency, and her face showed no triumph, no pride, no gloating. She simply did her work, as she always did, maintaining the flame that kept them all alive. But inside, she felt something she had never felt before. Not quite happiness. Her life was still hard, still dangerous, still balanced on the edge of survival, but something close to it, something like belonging, something like recognition. She had persisted, and she had won, not through becoming strong, but through remaining herself, dedicated, patient, essential, the firekeeper who would not be extinguished. As dawn began to break over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink, the band settled back into the cave. The entrance was cleared enough to be functional, though it would take days to fully restore it. The fire burned bright and warm, exactly where it belonged, and Crag sat beside it in his usual place, with Nira at her usual position, maintaining her eternal vigil over the flames. But now everything was different. Now everyone knew what she was worth. Now even Vara had bowed her head. The fire crackled and danced, and Nira fed it another stick, watching the wood catch and burn. She thought about Orin's words, about persistence and survival, about refusing to die even when everything suggested you should. She had learned the lesson well, and she would never forget it. The summer arrived with warmth that soaked into the bones of the band, driving away the last memories of winter's brutal cold. The valley transformed into a place of abundance. Herds of horses and deer grazed on thick grass, berry bushes hung heavy with fruit, and the river ran clear and full with fish that could be caught by hand in the shallow pools. It should have been a time of ease and celebration, but the dynamics within the band remained complicated, fragile, still adjusting to the earthquake that had reshaped their social structure on that moonlit night. Vara remained with the band, but her position had been permanently altered. She was no longer the dominant female, no longer the one whose word carried weight in decisions. She performed her tasks, gathering, preparing hides, helping with the children, but there was a hollow quality to her movements now, as if some essential fire had been extinguished inside her. She spoke little, avoided eye contact with most band members, and never came near the fire unless absolutely necessary. Shala had stepped carefully away from her former alliance with Vara, repositioning herself as a reliable, neutral presence focused entirely on practical matters. She tended the young, prepared food efficiently and made no attempt to compete for status or attention. It was survival through erasure of ambition, and it seemed to be working. The real transformation had occurred among the younger females. Kessa had emerged as a new voice of authority, not through physical dominance, but through competence and knowledge. She had fully mastered firekeeping under Nira's instruction and had begun teaching others, creating a network of females who understood this crucial skill. She also proved adept at organizing gathering expeditions and settling minor disputes, filling a leadership role that did not threaten the males, but provided necessary structure. And then there was Nira herself. The small firekeeper had not changed in her essential nature. She remained quiet, unassuming, dedicated to her work with the same patient persistence she had always shown. But the way others saw her had transformed completely. She was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed as useless. When she spoke, which was rarely, people listened. When she made suggestions, which was carefully and only when necessary, they were considered seriously. Most significantly, her position beside Craig had solidified into something that resembled partnership, though not in the traditional mating sense. Craig still accepted advances from other females when the season moved them, still fathered children with those deemed strong enough to bear them, but he spent his resting hours beside the fire, beside Nira, and there was a quality of companionship in their silence that spoke of something deeper than physical attraction. They understood each other, these two, the wounded alpha male whose strength had been diminished, but whose authority remained, and the fragile firekeeper whose weakness had proven to be a different kind of strength. They were both survivors who had persisted through circumstances that should have destroyed them. One warm afternoon, as Nira worked on creating a new technique for smoking meat to preserve it longer, Craig watched her with his characteristic silent attention. She had constructed a small structure of green branches over the fire, creating a chamber where smoke could concentrate around strips of deer meat suspended from sticks. The smoke would drive moisture from the meat and coat it with preservatives that would keep it edible for many days, perhaps even weeks. It was innovative, practical, and represented the kind of thinking that went beyond simple survival into planning for future scarcity. If the band could preserve meat during times of abundance, they would suffer less during inevitable periods of shortage. Craig made a sound, a low grunt of approval, and gestured for Torak and several other males to observe what Nira was doing. They gathered around the fire, these powerful hunters who could bring down massive prey with their spears, and they watched carefully as the small firekeeper explained her technique through gestures and simple sounds. "Smoke goes up," she said, using basic words that everyone understood. "Meat sits in smoke. Smoke changes meat, makes it last. No rot." Torak reached out and touched one of the strips that had been smoking for several hours. It was dry, leathery, dark with smoke residue. He broke off a piece and chewed it thoughtfully. The flavor was intense, concentrated, and though the texture was challenging, the meat was clearly preserved in a way that fresh meat never could be. "Good," Torak declared. "Fire Girl makes food last. This helps bands survive when hunting is poor." The other males grunted their agreement, and several of the females moved closer to see the technique for themselves. Nira found herself at the center of attention, teaching, explaining, demonstrating, a position she never could have imagined occupying just a few seasons ago. As the lesson continued, Vara passed by at a distance, carrying a basket of roots back from a gathering expedition. She glanced toward the group around the fire, saw Nira surrounded by attentive band members, saw the respect and interest on their faces. For just a moment, something like her old fury flashed across Vara's features, but then it faded, replaced by the hollow resignation that had become her constant expression. She continued walking, disappearing into the depths of the cave with her basket, no longer relevant to the band's moment-by-moment life in any significant way. It was a kind of death, Nira realized, not physical but the death of status, of purpose, of mattering, and watching it, Nira felt an unexpected emotion, pity. She understood now what she had not understood before. Vara's strength had been everything to her, her identity, her value, her reason for existence. When that strength had proven insufficient to solve the problem of the firekeeper, when persistence had defeated power, Vara had lost not just a competition, but her entire sense of self. Nira could have gloated. She could have enjoyed her victory, savored the reversal of their positions, but she did not, because she understood, in a way Vara never could, that survival was not about defeating others. It was simply about continuing to exist, continuing to contribute, continuing to burn despite everything that tried to extinguish you. As the days passed and the technique of smoking meat became standard practice for the band, Nira began to notice other opportunities for innovation. She experimented with different types of wood to see which produced the best smoke for preservation. She discovered that certain herbs added to the fire would impart flavors to the meat that made it more palatable. She developed a method for storing the smoked meat in birch bark containers lined with dry grass. which kept it from absorbing moisture from the air. Each small innovation increased the band's chances of surviving the coming winter, and each innovation increased Nira's value, making her more essential, more integrated into the fabric of the band's daily life. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in how the band thought about strength and weakness themselves. One evening, as the band gathered around the fire to share a meal, one of the younger males, barely old enough to hunt, approached Crag with a question. His name was Tern, and he had been born with a twisted foot that made running difficult. In a harsher time, he might not have survived infancy, but the band had been relatively prosperous during his youth, and he had lived, though always aware of his disadvantage. "Crag," Tern said, his voice hesitant, "I cannot run fast, cannot chase prey, cannot be strong hunter, but I watch Fire Girl, I learn, I think maybe I can help band different way, not with strong legs, with knowledge. Is this acceptable?" It was an extraordinary question, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about value and contribution. In the old hierarchy, Tern would have been marginal at best, barely tolerated, surviving on scraps and charity. But he had seen Nira's transformation and recognized that perhaps there was more than one path to mattering. Crag looked at the young male for a long moment, his heavy brow furrowed in thought. Then he looked at Nira, and something passed between them, a silent question and answer, a recognition of what was being asked and what it meant. Finally, Crag nodded. He gestured toward Nira, toward the fire, toward the smoking rack and the preserved meat, and all the innovations that had emerged from patient observation and careful thought. "Learn," Crag said, the single word carrying enormous meaning. "Different strength, still strength. Band needs many kinds." Tern's face transformed with relief and joy. He moved to sit beside Nira, and she began to teach him, showing him the techniques of firekeeping and preservation, passing on knowledge that would give him purpose and value despite his physical limitations. And watching this, other band members began to reconsider their own assumptions. The old firekeeper Orin was consulted more frequently about weather patterns and seasonal changes, knowledge he had accumulated over his many winters. A female named Pala, who was too small to compete physically but had exceptional eyesight, became invaluable as a lookout, spotting distant herds and potential dangers before anyone else. A male named Court, whose throwing arm had been damaged in a hunting accident, began working with plant fibers to create better ropes and cordage, improving the band's tools and carrying equipment. The hierarchy did not disappear. It could not, in a world where physical capability often meant the difference between eating and starving, between safety and death. Strong hunters were still valued, capable gatherers were still essential, females who could bear healthy children were still respected, but the hierarchy had expanded, had become more nuanced, had made room for different types of contribution. It was a quiet revolution, barely noticeable from day to day but profound in its long-term implications. And at the center of it all was the small firekeeper, who had simply refused to die, who had persisted when every rational calculation suggested she should give up, who had discovered that the weakest flame carefully tended could outlast the fiercest blaze. As summer reached its peak, and then began its slow decline toward autumn, Nira found herself in a position she had never imagined possible. She was not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most beautiful, or fertile, or dominant, but she was necessary, she was valued, she was, in her own way, powerful. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and red, Crag sat beside the fire in his usual place. His broken arm had healed as much as it ever would, leaving him permanently weakened but still functional. His ribs no longer pained him except in cold weather or when he moved awkwardly. He was aging, everyone could see it, and eventually he would be challenged by a younger, stronger male. That was the way of things, but for now he remained the alpha male and he remained beside the fire, beside Nira. He reached out with his good hand and picked up one of the willow ember baskets that Nira had created. He examined it carefully, turning it over, testing its strength and flexibility. Then he looked at her, and his expression was thoughtful, almost wondering. "Small things," he said, struggling with words as he always did. "Small things make big difference. I not understand before. Strong body, strong spear, these I understand. But keeping fire alive, making food last, teaching others, never giving up, these also strength, different strength, maybe better strength." Nira felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had not cried from sadness or pain in a long time, and she would not cry from joy or gratitude either. She simply nodded, accepting his words. understanding that they represented a hard-won wisdom that had cost both of them dearly to acquire. "Fire teaches," she said quietly. "Fire shows that persistence is power. Fire shows that small flame, carefully guarded, outlasts big flame that burns too fast and dies." Crag nodded slowly, and then he did something remarkable. He smiled. It was a small expression, barely a shift of his heavy features, but it was genuine, a moment of shared understanding, of connection that went beyond hierarchy, or mating, or any of the usual relationships that bound the band together. They were friends, Nira realized. This massive, wounded alpha male and the small, fragile firekeeper had become something like friends, united by their parallel experiences of nearly dying, of being diminished, of finding ways to survive and contribute, despite their limitations. Across the cave, Vara sat alone in the shadows, watching this exchange with empty eyes. She had once dreamed of sitting beside Crag, of being chosen above all others, of ruling the band as the dominant female beside the dominant male. But she had misunderstood what mattered, had confused strength with value, had believed that the ability to crush others was the same as the ability to sustain them. Now she understood differently. But the understanding had come too late, and the cost had been everything she had once been. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky and the fire settled into its nighttime rhythm, Nira fed the flames with her usual careful attention. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from invisible to essential, from worthless to valued, from weak to strong, in ways that had nothing to do with muscles or speed or the ability to dominate others. She had learned that survival was not about being the strongest. It was about being the one who would not stop burning, no matter how many times the wind tried to blow you out. And that lesson, she knew, was one she would carry for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. Because in this harsh world where death waited around every corner and survival was never guaranteed, the only true strength was the stubborn, patient, persistent refusal to be extinguished. The fire crackled and danced, and Nira smiled, a small private expression that no one else could see. She had won, not through defeating Vara, but through outlasting her, not through becoming strong, but through remaining herself, the firekeeper, the persistent one, the small flame that would not die. The leaves turned gold and red, painting the valley in colors that warned of winter's approach. The band worked with increased urgency now, gathering the last berries, smoking as much meat as possible, preparing hides and furs for the cold months ahead. They had survived many winters, but each one brought its own dangers, and only the prepared would see another spring. Nira had become central to these preparations in ways that went far beyond simply tending the fire. Her smoking techniques had been refined and expanded, and now several smoking racks stood near the fire pit, each one laden with strips of meat in various stages of preservation. Her students, now numbering more than a dozen, had become skilled in their own right, and they worked together to process the abundant harvest from the autumn hunts. But something else was changing too, something Nira had not anticipated and did not quite know how to process. Her body, which had always been thin and weak, was beginning to fill out slightly. The regular access to choice portions of meat, a privilege that came with her new status, had added a thin layer of flesh to her bones. Her arms, while still slender, showed the definition of muscles developed from constant work with wood and fire. Her face, once hollow and haunted, had gained a subtle roundness that suggested health rather than starvation. She was still small, still the least physically imposing member of the band, but she no longer looked like she was dying. She looked like she was surviving. And in this world, that was a remarkable transformation. More remarkably still, she had begun to bleed with the cycles of the moon. It had happened for the first time just after the summer solstice, a sign that her body, finally adequately nourished, had decided it was capable of bearing children after all. She had hidden this development at first, uncertain what it meant, frightened that it might change things in ways she could not control. But Kessa had noticed, as had several of the other females, and they had explained to her what she needed to know, how to manage the bleeding, how to prepare for the possibility that a male might seek to mate with her now that her body had announced its fertility. "You are small," Kessa had said practically, "but small females can bear children. Will be hard for you, maybe dangerous, but possible. You should think about this. Think about who you might accept if someone asks." Nira had not known how to respond. The idea of mating, of bearing children, of being sought after in that way, It all seemed impossibly distant from who she understood herself to be. She was the firekeeper. That was her identity, her purpose, her entire existence. The thought of adding another role, another responsibility, another way to fail and disappoint filled her with anxiety. But then, late one evening as the band settled in for the night, Crag had approached her with an unusual directness. He sat down beside the fire in his customary place, but instead of simply settling into comfortable silence as they usually did, he turned to face her fully, his heavy features serious. "Nira," he said, using the sound that served as her name, something he rarely did. "You are fertile now. Other males see this. Some may ask to mate." Nira's heart began to hammer with anxiety. She nodded slightly, acknowledging that she understood. Crag continued, his words coming slowly as he worked to express something complex. "You are small. Bearing children will be dangerous for you, maybe fatal. But this is your choice. No one can force." He paused, making sure she was listening, making sure she understood the importance of what he was saying. "If you choose to mate, choose carefully. Choose male who will protect you, who will value you, who will not abandon you if bearing is difficult." He paused again, his dark eyes holding hers. "Choose male who understands that different kinds of strength matter, that persistence is power, that keeping flame alive is as important as bringing down prey." Nira's breath caught in her throat as she understood what he was really saying. He was not directly offering himself. That would be too presumptuous, too much like forcing a choice. But he was making it clear that if she chose him, he would accept, that he valued her, that he would protect her through the dangerous process of bearing children, if that was what she wanted. For a long moment, she could not speak. The idea that someone, that the alpha male himself, might genuinely want to mate with her, might see value in creating children with the weakest female in the band, seemed impossible. But Crag's expression was sincere, patient, waiting for her response, without pressure or demand. "I am afraid," Nira finally whispered. "Afraid of bearing, afraid of dying, afraid of failing." Crag nodded slowly. "Fear is wise. Bearing is dangerous. But you survive many dangerous things. You survive Vara's hatred. You survive Rockfall. You survive being weakest when strongest wanted you dead. You persist. This is your strength." He reached out with his good hand and very gently touched her face, his rough fingers surprisingly tender against her cheek. "If you choose to bear children, they will be small like you, maybe weak in body, but they will have your persistence, your refusal to die, your ability to find strength in places others do not look. This is valuable. This is worth passing to next generation." Nira felt tears begin to slide down her cheeks, but she did not brush them away. She understood now what he was truly saying, that he valued her not despite her weakness, but because of what she had made of that weakness, how she had transformed it into a different kind of power, how she had refused to accept the death sentence that nature and society had both pronounced on her. "I would choose you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "If I choose to mate, I would choose you, because you understand, because you see me, because you crawled to the fire when everyone said you should go to the strong females." Crag's heavy features softened into something approaching tenderness. "I crawled to the fire because fire keeps life, and you keep fire. Simple, but also complicated, both true at same time." He paused, then added, "You do not have to decide now. You do not have to decide ever if you do not want. Your value to band does not depend on bearing children. You already contribute much, already essential. This is different choice, separate from survival or status." It was the most he had ever spoken to her at one time, and the effort of expressing such complex thoughts clearly exhausted him. But the message had been delivered, and Nira understood it completely. She was being offered a choice, freely given, with no pressure or obligation. Whatever she decided, her position in the band was secure. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into the first touches of winter, Nira thought carefully about Crag's words. She watched the mothers with their children, saw both the joy and the terrible cost of bearing and raising young. She saw Shala with her 3 surviving children, strong and healthy, but bearing the scars of difficult births. She saw other females who had lost children, who had nearly died themselves bringing life into the world. But she also saw the way mothers looked at their offspring, the fierce, protective love that transformed even the weakest female into someone formidable when her young were threatened. She saw the continuation of the band through generations, the way knowledge and skill passed from parent to child, ensuring that hard-won survival techniques were not lost. And she realized that bearing children, if she survived it, would be another form of persistence, another way of refusing to let her line die out, another way of saying to the world that even the weakest flame could create new fires that would burn long after she was gone. One cold evening, as the first snow began to fall outside the cave, Nira made her decision. She approached Krag where he sat preparing his weapons for the next day's hunt, and she knelt beside him in the posture that indicated she wanted to speak seriously. "I have decided," she said quietly. "I will mate. With you, if you still wish it. I am frightened, but I understand now that fear does not mean I should not try. Fire is afraid of water, but fire still burns near streams. Fear and action can exist together." Krag set down the spear he had been sharpening and looked at her with an expression that might have been relief, might have been joy, might have been simple acknowledgement. "You are sure? You understand danger?" "I understand," Nira confirmed. "But I also understand that if I die without trying to pass on what I have learned, then all my persistence means nothing. Knowledge must continue. Fire must be passed to new keepers. This is how survival works. Not just individual survival, but band survival, generation survival." Krag reached out and took her small hand in his massive one, engulfing her thin fingers completely. "Then we mate. And if you bear children, I will protect them. Will protect you. Will make sure they learn your strength, not just my strength. Will teach them that persistence matters more than power." That night, they mated for the first time, and it was awkward and uncomfortable and nothing like the powerful couplings Nira had witnessed between stronger members of the band. But there was gentleness in it, and care, and a kind of understanding that went beyond physical compatibility. And as the winter deepened and the snow piled high outside the cave, Nira's belly began to swell with the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. She continued her work with the fire, continued teaching her students, continued innovating and contributing. But now she also planned for the future, preparing for the possibility that she might survive bearing a child, preparing for the chance to pass her knowledge directly to a new generation. The band watched this development with interest and some concern. Everyone knew that Nira's small frame made childbearing exceptionally dangerous for her. Old Orin, consulting his vast memory of births he had witnessed over his long life, estimated that her chances of survival were perhaps half, a grim calculation that made many in the band uneasy. But Nira faced this danger with the same patient persistence she had always shown. She prepared carefully, gathering the plants that Shala said could help with birthing pain and bleeding. She practiced breathing techniques that other mothers taught her. She made plans for who would take over firekeeping if she died, ensuring that her knowledge would not be lost. And she kept burning, kept working, kept contributing right up until the day the birthing pains began. It was early spring when her time came, when the ice was melting and the first green shoots were pushing through the snow. The birthing was as difficult as everyone had feared. Hours of agony, dangerous bleeding, moments when it seemed certain that both mother and child would die. Shayla and Kessa and the other experienced females worked frantically, using every technique they knew, every plant and pressure and position that might help. Krag stood outside the birthing area. Males were not permitted to be present during this female mystery, and his face was carved from stone, revealing nothing. But Torak, standing beside him, could see the tension in his shoulders, could see how his fists clenched and unclenched, could see how his eyes never left the entrance to the birthing space where sounds of pain and urgent voices emerged. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a new sound cut through the others, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn infant, and then, miracle of miracles, Nira's voice, weak, exhausted, but alive. "She lives," Shala's voice called out, and there was wonder in her tone. "Both live. Small, very small, but breathing. Both breathing." The baby was a female, tiny even by the standards of newborns, weighing no more than a small rabbit. For the first days, many in the band believed she would not survive. She was too small, too weak, too fragile to endure. But the infant, whom Nira named Kira after the sound of crackling fire, proved to have inherited her mother's most important trait, persistence. She nursed, though weakly. She breathed, though her breaths were shallow. She cried, though her voice was thin. And day by day, despite all predictions, she continued to live. Nira recovered slowly from the birthing, her already small body reduced to near skeletal thinness by the ordeal. But she refused to stay down for long. Within days, she was back beside the fire, teaching with little Kira tied to her chest in a sling, showing her students that even motherhood did not have to stop a female from contributing, from working, from maintaining the flame that kept them all alive. And as the spring progressed and Kira grew stronger, the band began to understand that something extraordinary had happened. The weakest female in the band had survived bearing a child. The smallest infant anyone could remember had lived past its first vulnerable days. Persistence had triumphed again, not through luck, but through the careful preparation, the accumulated knowledge, the community support that Nira had built through years of patient work. Little Kira would never be strong in the traditional sense. She would always be small, always be physically limited. But watching Nira teach her daughter, watching how knowledge flowed from mother to child, watching how the infant's eyes tracked the flames even before she could focus properly on anything else, the band began to understand that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of lineage. Not the lineage of the strongest, but the lineage of the most persistent. Not the line of the most dominant, but the line of the most essential. Not the children of power, but the children of fire. Small flames carefully tended, refusing to die, passing their warmth to new generations. As summer returned and the valley bloomed with life, Nira sat beside the fire with Kira nursing at her breast, and students gathered around learning her latest innovation. Crag sat nearby, his healing arm resting across his lap, his eyes moving between his mate and his daughter with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Across the cave, Vara sat in her usual shadowed corner, watching the scene with eyes that had grown distant and unfocused. She was aging rapidly now, her strength fading, her purpose lost. In another season or two, she would likely die, not from violence or disease, but simply from the erosion of will that came when someone no longer understood why they should continue surviving. It was a sad end for one who had once been magnificent, but Nira felt only distant pity for her former tormentor. Vara had taught her important lessons, had shown her what strength looked like when it was the only value you possessed, had demonstrated what happened when that strength failed, and there was nothing else to fall back on. Nira had learned those lessons well, and she would teach them to Kira and to all her students. She would teach them that strength was valuable but temporary, that power was useful but unreliable, that dominance was satisfying but fleeting. But persistence, that stubborn, patient, relentless refusal to be extinguished, that was eternal. That was the true strength. That was what allowed weak flames to outlast mighty blazes. That was what allowed the smallest members of the band to become the most essential. That was what transformed the firekeeper from the most invisible member of the group into the very center of their survival. As the sun set and the stars emerged, Nira fed the fire with her usual careful attention. Little Kira dozed at her breast, one tiny hand resting against her mother's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat that promised safety and continuation. Crag's breathing grew deep and regular as he drifted into sleep. The band settled into their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that the fire would burn through the night as it always did, as it always would. And Nira looked into the flames and thought about old Orin, who had died peacefully in his sleep just before winter came. She thought about his final words to her, whispered in a voice like dry leaves. You understand now, fire is not about being strong. Fire is about refusing to die. Teach this to your children. Teach this to your children's children. This is the most important knowledge. This is what makes humans survive when stronger animals perish. She had promised him she would teach it. And she would keep that promise for the rest of her life and beyond, passing the knowledge of persistence down through generations of firekeepers who would carry the flame forward into an uncertain future. Because that was what fire did. It persisted. It adapted. It found ways to survive even when everything suggested it should go out. It burned in the darkness, pushing back the cold and the predators and the endless threats that waited just beyond the circle of light. And as long as the fire burned, as long as someone tended it with patient dedication, as long as the knowledge passed from keeper to keeper, the band would survive. The weak would find their strength, the small would discover their value, and the persistent would outlast them all. The fire crackled and danced, and Nira smiled, a small, peaceful expression that spoke of contentment earned through suffering, of wisdom gained through surviving, of strength discovered in the most unlikely places. She had been the weakest. She had been nothing. She had been the one everyone expected to die, but she had refused. And in refusing, she had changed everything. The firekeeper who would not be extinguished, the small flame that grew into something essential, the persistent one who proved that survival belonged not to the strongest, but to those who simply refused to die. Little Kira stirred against her mother's chest, and Nira adjusted the infant gently, making sure she was warm and secure. In a few seasons, when the child was old enough, Nira would begin teaching her about fire, how to read the flames, how to feed them properly, how to understand that their warmth represented more than simple heat. She would teach Kira that fire was a metaphor for life itself, that persistence mattered more than power, that refusing to die was its own form of strength, that the smallest flame, carefully guarded, could outlast the fiercest blaze. And Kira would learn, as her mother had learned, as generations of firekeepers would learn after her. She would understand that survival was not about defeating others, but about continuing to burn despite everything that tried to extinguish you. The band slept, the fire burned, and outside the cave, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small drama of human survival that played out beneath them. But for those humans, for that band, for the firekeeper and her daughter and all who would come after them, the drama was everything. It was life and death, meaning and purpose, the difference between existence and extinction. And at the center of it all was the fire, persistent, essential, eternal. The flame that would not die, tended by keepers who understood that their greatest strength lay not in their bodies, but in their absolute refusal to surrender, no matter how many times the wind tried to blow them out. The fire crackled one last time, and Nira closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest. She had survived, she had won, not through becoming strong, but through remaining herself, dedicated, patient, essential. The firekeeper, the persistent one, the small flame that changed everything, and the legacy of that flame would burn on long after she was gone, carried forward by daughters and students, and all who learned the most important lesson, that in a world of violence and strength and dominance, sometimes the greatest power belonged to those who simply refused to die.